Hi, welcome everybody. I'm Becky Marby, Professor at London South Bank University, and I am delighted to have Mick Ward here today. We have been exploring together, I guess over many years, the power and the importance of the voluntary community sector in order for the NHS to be able to do the best work it can do, and it's becoming more and more important. And as we have been working on a programme of work called Universal Healthcare, making sure that everybody has a fair chance of health in this country, we have become more and more interested about this relationship between the NHS and the voluntary and community sector as a phenomenal and great partner to help people live well. And so I asked Mick if he would come and talk to us about his experience about developing effective partnerships between the third sector and health and care, so that we can all learn about the best way to do this. And so, Mick, I'm going to pass over to you. I'll be your Chris Whitty slide change person, please. I'm really looking forward to the session.
Okay, Becky, thanks very much. I won't mind if you disappear off the screen for a bit. So I'm Mick Ward. I suppose I do work with Becky now, but I did retire from full-time work a couple of years ago. But I worked within particular adult social care, but later in my career jointly with health. And I was the Deputy Director for Health and Care in Leeds, which is a joint post between the then CCGs, PCTs before that, of course, and adult social care and public health. And within that role, I was responsible for commissioning, both within social care and public health, but also the sort of integrated commissioning across health and care. But core within that, I would say, about the whole process, both of commissioning and our strategic work, was that strong collaboration and partnership between the third sector, health and care. And I'm just really going to pick out what I think some of the factors were that made that happen that can be used elsewhere. So first slide, which just covers the sort of opening 6 lines, Becca, which are key about that political leadership, of course, the need to really understand the breadth of the sector, critical to have a strong infrastructure for the third sector, those partnership structures in place. That engagement has to be across the piece, across all commissioning and strategic development. And probably most importantly, and maybe in some senses the hardest, culture. So I'll just explore each of those a bit further over the next 10 minutes or so. So first slide of that proper list, Becky, please. So starting with that political and leadership support, I suppose the two things are, of course, by its nature, leadership, it sort of comes from the top. But I would suggest there is a role for all of us in supporting that leadership in terms of their understanding and relationship of the third sector. Obviously, as somebody who worked for the council my whole life, I would see councillors as key as that, but I would widen that to wider engagement politically, MPs and so on. And of course, understanding the role of councillors and their oversight through things like scrutiny within health. It's not just their role in managing local authorities, but critically in that is that understanding and that leadership. It's got to be at that partnership level, whether that is the Health and Wellbeing Board or the Integrated Care Board. It's really important that they set the agenda, in a sense, for how the system is going to operate in partnership with the third sector. And of course, that then has to go down to senior teams. And I would say within that, even though this probably has a bit of a focus on commissioning, it is the senior teams within adult social care, public health, housing, NHS, but providers as well, the key role of anchor organisations and their potential of relating to the NHS. And at the heart of that and gaining that leadership and then being able to perform it well is that understanding of the third sector. I will particularly pick out, it's about the breadth of the sector, understanding that, the third sector does go from those major organisations, including carrying out statutory functions, within running care homes, delivering home care, delivering mental health services and so on, all the way to, I suppose, those things that are probably closer to the world of associations. So understanding just the scale of the sector is important and those different functions that they will provide. Some of it is statutory, some of it non-statutory, maybe more in prevention. And of course, critically, a lot of it very local, very neighbourhood, very community. And of course, they have the whole breadth of structures as well, from very rigid organisations to ones that are much more fluid and volunteer-led. And of course, third sector organisations that are both part of local collaborations or are local parts of a national organisation. So understanding that is critical. Hugely though, and I think particularly now an increased focus is around their potential to invest to save. But they are more than prevention. You know, the third sector is not just about invest to save, it's about their quality of delivery. But there is very strong evidence that holding your nerve and continuing to fund the third sector will reap benefits further down the line. And that's a really important thing to understand as a commissioner. And also, just to remind people, much as I'm a champion of the third sector, they are part of that provider landscape. They're not just community organisations. I think there's sometimes a sense that people see them as a bit of a proxy for community. They're not, apart from very specialist third sector ones, you know. They may do very well having good leadership from the community in their delivery, maybe a bit more than we do in the statutory sector, but ultimately they are providers and should be seen as that. Next slide. I think the next element to recognise then is if it's going to work well, much as like we need that infrastructure to work within the statutory sector, within the NHS, that range of organisations, either as individually or working together, and particularly when we start to look at partnering with local authorities, is that they need to have that ability to hold together. So one of the things, and these are examples from Leeds, but you'll see them elsewhere where these partnerships are good, that you will have things like voluntary action, you know, those organisations that are there to really support the sector, all the way down to the minutiae of things like helping them with payroll. But critically, it's about bringing those together. Doing Good Leeds is almost like the trade name of Val in Leeds. And what we found by working with them is we could deliver pieces of work together. So, for example, Val pulled together a group from a very broad representation of the third sector, whilst we brought a very broad representation of commissioners together to do work on implementation of the Social Value Act. And that became a real guide and a real almost into the DNA, as I come back to culture a bit later on, of how we worked. And the other key bit is to have that strong representation. There is so much third sector within health and care. I would generally argue that most areas need some forum for pulling those together. And that could be a generic forum that looks across the breadth of health and wellbeing, but maybe with some focus in each area. You know, so you have an upbit that particularly looks at mental health, learning disability in older people. And that really both represents the broad width, as I was saying, the third sector, but crucially, a real chance for them to put that evidence forward, to do that representation, to be the group you go to have that engagement with the third sector. And that really helps with the next element about having those partnerships in place. And I would argue a twin track here. I think there is a need for a third sector representation board itself, something that really champions the third sector. So in Leeds, we had the third sector partnership, third sector Leeds, deliberately chaired by councillors to give it that political clout. I'm sure it also made sure that senior commissioners turned up to those meetings because it had that leadership. But that was a group that all major discussions around the third sector went there for engagement and consultation. Whether you're doing a new piece of work, whether you were re-looking at the budget, it tracked the investment into the third sector year on year, and became a real place for the third sector really to challenge how well we were working and delivering on our promises on that effective partnership. And then through that, and through things particularly set through the infrastructure, it is making sure you have that representation on boards, that there is a good third sector rep on the health and wellbeing board on the ICB, that whatever the group is, whether it's, you know, the dementia strategy, the carers strategy, the mental health strategy, strong third sector representation on that. And critically, third sector representation that can go back to its base and do that further engagement. And I'd actually put that all the way down to more specific working parties. I picked randomly hospital discharge as one, but having that view and that understanding of the potential of the third sector built in linear through the whole system really helped. And then finally, the sort of couple of areas, particularly to think about it in terms of commissioning. About commissioning, I both mean, the commissioning procurement end of it, but also commissioning the strategic development side of it. I see those two things as very much tied together in good commissioning. So I would expect, along with other partners, really strong engagement with the third sector when you really start the beginning of any new commissioning process or any review, and not just the third sector organisations directly involved in that specific bit of commissioning, but ensuring that wider view. And then crucially, and this can be a challenge, ensuring that representation falls throughout the process. You do have to be careful in terms of potential conflicts of interest, but because your engagement's wide, because you use the infrastructure, you can get around that. So you do have that view all the way through the elements that you need through that commissioning cycle. And of course, within that, you do need to get the specs right, the appropriate specifications, the appropriate processes, the appropriate procurement. The outcome you get depends on the process you get. And one of the key things was to make procurement your friend, but to actually think about what it is that you're trying to do. And certainly, I think two things helped in that. One of which is really thinking about outcomes, but within that, actually recognising you're also wanting to look at the way that organisations work, how they're based, how they're delivered, so you can quite legally and appropriately and get the best bang for your buck, build within that specifications that do favour small local organisations, that do favour citizen-led or user-led, the sorts of things that make it easier for the third sector. You can also really make it clear that you want those small local organisations and build things in terms of processes and time on understanding and commissioning structures, and going back and checking to make sure that works, particularly for some of the smaller third sector organisations who struggle in some of the bigger procurements. And finally, and I admit this is the hardest one in some ways, this only happens if you've got a culture. But what I mean by that is you've got to want this to happen, but you can work on culture. Sometimes it feels easier to work on a process. Oh, we can do this, but you can at the same time work on the culture about understanding that potential. And just two simple things there. It is about promoting across the system the potential of the third sector, its successes. Going back through that list I've just done, it is about making sure that examples of great practice in the third sector do get on the health and wellbeing world agenda, are written into the dementia strategy. I'd also challenge the third sector itself to make sure it gets out there and does that promotion so that those conversations become into the DNA of the system. And then lastly, and my simple plea to anybody within the system, be a commissioner or a provider, is just to get out there, to spend time within the sector. I've always thought good commissioners are really passionate about the services they commission. That, of course, will go across the board in terms of provision, but it should include the third sector. And just spend time out there, hold your staff meetings in third sector organisations. If you're having big events, can you do that in a third sector building rather than going off to some hotel? Just spend time in the sector and really get to understand it. And that will shift the culture, that will create more collaboration, and then you can write the processes in to support it.
Mick,
anything you want to add?
A couple of things, really. It seems to me there are two things that really matter. One is that contracts that are a long enough time, and I know Leeds, you were sort of experimenting with contracts that are around 7 years. I don't even know if that's possible in this world anymore. And the second thing was, how do you do? Should the NHS fund, I suppose, the sort of coordination of the health and care third sector groups together? The sort of front door of the third sector for the NHS to make it easier for everybody. And just your thoughts on that, really.
Yeah, I mean, firstly, you can. I mean, you have to have an argument within procurement about why, say, something is more than 3 years. I mean, I would go 3 years as a basic, unless for some complicated reason you don't have the money. And I'd always build in potential extensions within that, so you don't have to go back and redo it. So 3 + 1 + 1, that sort of thing. But we actually, particularly for some ones where we knew this is what we wanted to do, we'd had the history of stability, we knew we didn't organisations going through it. We moved to, I suppose, the far end of that was 5 + 5. And actually, in some cases, we moved to grants. back to grants rather than contracts because they made it easier for people to get into the system. So you do need horses for courses, pick the right one. But if you look back to, you know, what I was saying about outcomes and what you're trying to achieve, generally stability is a really key thing. One of the things we found by funding organisations longer, they could actually bring in more money, the third sector. It was easier for them to get further funding if they could say, yeah, we've got another 3 years on this contract, so can we have funding to do this extra bit? I think that really helped. It also meant they weren't spending, I mean, you know, 3 months of the year thinking, oh my God, we've got to reapply and do all this. So it is a much more effective thing. I think in terms of your second one, were you thinking more about the funding from health into the infrastructure or the funding to ensure third sector involved in specific pieces of work, as in hospital discharge?
Yeah, more about the
Yeah, well, yeah, and the simple answer was you get a good bang for your buck out of it. It starts to become easier to engage with the third sector. And one of the really pleasing things that I saw over the last few years was the way that when new pieces of work themselves, like the ICB, and so on, it was automatically thinking, oh, we need third sector representation on that. But prior to us having a strong infrastructure, it would be, oh, well, who do we get? You know, do we choose this one organisation and then have we offended all the others? Whereas because we had that group, they would either themselves, through their small staff team, do it, or they would internally find a representation, but then they would go back. I always remember once when Leeds was successful in getting some significant funding in, one of the bits of feedback as to why Leeds got it was, oh, it seemed really clear where the money was going to sit, you know, in this organisation. Whereas in a lot of other cities had spent the first 6 months arguing over as to who was going to host it. Whereas in Leeds, it was clear it would sit with the infrastructure organisation and they would then do the work. It made my life as a commissioner so much easier. I mean, really flippant. It meant I could just send out one email and then the infrastructure organisation would think, oh yeah, that needs to go out to everybody in the sector who does this part of the work. So it just made our lives so much easier. And that cut across health. As you do that more and more, also the quality gets higher. And people really saw that. They saw the desire of the third sector to help out on those major pieces of work.
And this remind us what that infrastructure organisation was called, Mick, so people could Google if they want to.
Yeah, the main one is Forum Central. So that's the umbrella organisation for third sector in Leeds.
That's great.
Within that, there's actually specific groups still. So there's Leeds Old People's Forum. There's the Physical and Sensory Impairment Network. There's Tenfold, which is learning disability, and Volition Mental. So they don't lose their own identity. They have that as well. But Forum Central pulls the whole thing together. And you will see on that site, as well as a huge membership, you will see their views and their reporting from all the work streams that you would expect to see. And vice versa, if you look at the major reports or strategic pieces of work coming out of Leeds, you'll see it referenced back as their engagement with Forum Central.
Thank you, Mick. So I'd encourage people who've been watching this and listening to it to think not only about secondary care and discharge, but primary care, that, you know, people who turn up frequently in general practice, about 40% of your list, about half of those are people who turn up repeatedly over time. Have a look at how many of those folks are struggling with life or could benefit from some third and community sector organisational support and reach out to them. So I think where you've got that infrastructure, Mick, I think the NHS needs to be forming these really great collaborative relationships, because a lot of what we're dealing with now is a complex mix of social determinants, things that require social care, things that require the NHS, and we can only do it together. And sometimes the NHS is not the best front door, a voluntary community sector is too. So yeah, really appreciate it. Thank you, Mick, for your time.
Cheers, thank you. Best wishes, everyone.